It's becoming a recurring theme. People who voted for policies that harm them are now expressing shock and outrage when those policies start affecting their lives. One meme perfectly captures this phenomenon. "I never thought leopards would eat my face," says the guy who voted for the Leopards eating people's faces party. Over the next several years, we're going to see more examples of this irony play out in real time. The latest example involves Donald Trump voters coming to grips with the very consequences of his policies, which he made abundantly clear during his campaigns. Trump was transparent about many of his most damaging proposals, but supporters either ignored or underestimated the impact of those promises. Now, those consequences are starting to hit home, leaving some of his supporters in a state of panic. Policies that were never hidden. Donald Trump is known for his frequent lies, often exaggerating achievements or making claims without evidence. But when it came to some of his most harmful policy goals, Trump didn't try to hide them. He openly discussed plans such as imposing tariffs, initiating mass deportations, dismantling federal programs, and slashing education funding. These were not vague statements or campaign rhetoric. They were spelled out for anyone paying attention. For instance, Trump's stance on tariffs was well documented. He argued that imposing tariffs would benefit the U.S. economy, but experts warned that it would lead to higher costs for consumers and harm industries reliant on global supply chains. Likewise, his plans for immigration included ramping up deportations, which he claimed would restore law and order, but has led to chaos for families and industries reliant on immigrant labor. Despite these warnings, many voters who supported Trump are now surprised by the negative outcomes. The ongoing consequences of these policies have hit working-class Americans particularly hard, especially in states that strongly supported him in both elections. Education funding cuts. A case study in Kentucky. One recent example highlights how Trump's education policies are causing alarm among his own supporters. Tom Gambrell, the superintendent of Bell County, Kentucky, expressed concern about federal education funding cuts. Gambrell, who voted for Trump with the hope of improving opportunities for his students, now fears that Trump's plans to eliminate the Department of Education will devastate schools in his area. Gambrell told CNN that he didn't think anyone in his county voted to cut school funding. But here's the reality. They did. Trump's repeated calls to abolish the Department of Education and reduce federal funding for public schools were clear from the beginning. These cuts will have a disproportionate impact on rural and low-income areas, like Bell County, which rely heavily on federal support for education. Many states, particularly those in the South, are already struggling to fund their public schools. Kentucky is no exception. Without federal assistance, the state's education system faces significant layoffs, reduced resources, and worsening outcomes for students. Gambrell's own school district may find itself unable to pay its teachers or maintain basic services. States ill-equipped to handle the fallout. The broader problem is that many states simply don't have the resources to fill the funding gap left by federal cuts. Alabama, for example, was described by the United Nations as having poverty levels comparable to third-world countries. Families in some parts of the state live on less than $2 per day. Mississippi, Arkansas, and other states face similarly dire financial situations. If the Department of Education is eliminated, these states will be expected to fund their school systems entirely on their own. Even if federal money is redirected to the states as block grants, there's no guarantee that the funds will be used for education. Cash-strapped states are likely to divert those funds to other pressing needs, such as healthcare or infrastructure, leaving schools even worse off. Some supporters of these policies argue that block grants could solve the problem by giving states more flexibility. But history shows that without strict regulations, states often misuse funds intended for specific purposes. The idea that local governments will prioritize education over other immediate concerns is wishful thinking. The human cost of policy ignorance. This issue isn't confined to rural Kentucky. Teachers across the country, including some who voted for Trump, are starting to realize the implications of his policies. Many educators are now worried about losing their jobs, and some are even questioning their political allegiances. For example, the wife of a commentator who works in education has heard her colleagues express panic over the potential elimination of the Department of Education. Some of these teachers are die-hard Trump supporters, yet they're beginning to grapple with the fact that their votes may cost them their livelihoods. This pattern, voting for policies that ultimately harm oneself, is not new. It's a recurring feature of American politics, particularly among voters in red states. These voters often support candidates based on cultural issues, such as opposition to transgender rights or abortion, without considering the broader economic implications of their policies. Consequences for red states. The irony is that red states, which are most dependent on federal assistance, will be hit hardest by Trump's policies. Analyses consistently show that Republican-led states receive more in federal aid than they pay in taxes. These states rely on federal funding to support everything from healthcare to education. Eliminating or reducing that support will exacerbate existing inequalities and push already struggling communities further into poverty. When Trump announced his intent to cut federal programs, critics warned that these policies would disproportionately hurt his base. But many voters ignored those warnings, dismissing them as partisan fearmongering. Now the reality is setting in. Families are facing higher costs due to tariffs, farmers are losing markets for their crops, and teachers are worried about their jobs. Meanwhile, inflation and stagnant wages are making it harder for working-class Americans to make ends meet. A hard lesson for voters. The people most affected by these policies are often the ones who supported them. They're learning the hard way that there are real consequences to their votes. For months, critics warned that Trump's policies would harm his base, but those warnings were dismissed. Now, those same voters are expressing regret and confusion. It's easy to feel frustrated with these voters. After all, they were warned. They were told that Trump's promises to cut federal funding, impose tariffs, and deport immigrants would have severe consequences. But they chose to ignore those warnings, focusing instead on cultural issues that ultimately have little impact on their daily lives. Cultural distractions versus real consequences. One of the key strategies of Trump's campaigns was to emphasize cultural issues, such as transgender rights and bathroom policies, to energize his base. These issues often dominate political discourse, despite having little bearing on the economic realities of most Americans. Meanwhile, the policies that truly affect voters' lives, education funding, healthcare, wages, and infrastructure, take a back seat. Now, as the consequences of those neglected policies come into focus, many voters are realizing they've been distracted by cultural battles that don't address their most pressing concerns. It's a lesson in the importance of understanding how policies impact not just the nation, but individual communities and families. The fallout from Trump's policies is just beginning. Over the next several years, we're likely to see more examples of voters coming to terms with the consequences of their decisions. For now, the lesson is clear. Elections have consequences, and ignoring policy details in favor of cultural grievances can have devastating impacts on the very people who cast those votes.